When biological parents sell their daughter to pay off debts, and the only person who dares to save her is the city's most dangerous enemy. Friday nights in Black Hollow always smell of money and blood. People only smell which first. Tonight, in the private dining room of Valerio's steakhouse, a woman sits smiling with her parents while guns are silently locked to the back of her neck from 3 different directions. She doesn't know. But the woman behind the bar does. And she's racing against time to decide. Intervene or continue hiding as she has for the past 3 years. Like and comment the name of the city you're watching so I know how far this story has progressed. Stay tuned, because tonight isn't the worst yet. The rain had been falling since 4 in the afternoon and showed no sign of stopping. Celine Vey stood behind the bar at Valerio's steakhouse and polished crystal wine glasses with a white cloth, the way she had done every Friday night for the past 11 months. Her hands moved in slow, deliberate circles. Her eyes did not move at all. They stayed fixed on the private dining room at the far end of the restaurant, separated from the main floor by frosted glass panels and a velvet curtain the color of dried blood. The couple inside had arrived at 7:15. Reservation under the name Harmon. Party of 4, corner booth, champagne already chilled and waiting on the table when they sat down. Celine had read the reservation 3 days ago. She had spent those 3 days not sleeping. The man across the table from the Harmons was Damien Varela, 41 years old, 6 feet and 2 inches of controlled violence in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than Celine made in 4 months. His wife Elena sat beside him, early 30s, dark hair pulled back, wearing something simple and silver that made her look like she belonged in a different world than the one her husband occupied. Which was true. Elena Harmon had grown up wealthy, sheltered, the kind of woman who collected orchids and spoke 3 languages and genuinely believed that people were mostly good. Celine had spent 11 months watching Elena Varela move through this restaurant. She had a lot of opinions about people being mostly good. The Harmons, Elena's parents, sat across the booth with the careful posture of people who were frightened but working very hard not to show it. The father, Preston Harmon, kept touching his collar. The mother, Diane, had barely touched the champagne that had been poured for her 20 minutes ago. They were talking, laughing at the right moments, performing a dinner. Celine set the wine glass down, picked up another. She counted 7 men in the restaurant who had not been there last Friday. 3 sitting at separate tables, alone, nursing drinks they hadn't finished in 40 minutes. 2 positioned near the kitchen corridor, dressed in the dark slacks and white shirts of kitchen staff, but standing with a stillness that kitchen staff never had. The practiced stillness of people trained to wait. 1 near the fire exit at the south wall. 1 more she hadn't fully located yet, which bothered her more than the 6 she had. They weren't Damien's men. She knew his security detail by now. The way they moved, the positions they preferred, the small tells of how they scanned a room. These men scanned differently. These men were looking for a moment, not a threat. The distinction mattered. Marcus, the head bartender, slid in beside her and reached past for a bottle of Bordeaux. "Table 12 needs this run out," he said. "You good?" "I'm good," she said. He glanced at her. Marcus was 47, salt and pepper, the kind of man who had been bartending long enough to recognize when something was wrong without being able to name it. "You've been standing there for 20 minutes. Long night." "Celine." "I said I'm good, Marcus." He took the bottle and left. She watched the private room. At 7:58, the man she hadn't been able to locate walked out of the men's bathroom near the front entrance and took a position beside a potted palm tree that gave him a direct sightline to the private dining room. He was wearing a sport coat. He ordered nothing from the waitress who approached him. He simply stood there, checking his watch. 7:59. Celine's chest felt like something was pulling it inward from both sides. She had been running scenarios for 3 days, ever since she pulled the reservation file and cross-referenced the Harmon name against her brother's documents. The files Daniel had compiled in the last 2 months of his life were meticulous, the work of a man who understood exactly what he had gotten himself into and exactly how much danger he was carrying. Financial records, client lists, names tied to debt arrangements that didn't look like debt until you understood the Volkov Syndicate's preferred method. Extend credit at impossible rates, watch the interest compound, wait until the borrower's desperation made them useful. Preston and Diane Harmon had borrowed heavily during a bad real estate period 4 years ago. The initial sum was manageable. The interest was not. By the time Daniel's files recorded the last transaction, the Harmons owed $1,800,000 to people who did not accept payment plans. What the files didn't record, what Celine had only pieced together over the past 72 sleepless hours, was the arrangement that had apparently been offered in exchange for the debt. She had no proof. She had pattern recognition and 3 years of studying how the Volkov syndicate operated. She had the way Preston Harmon kept touching his collar. She had 7 men positioned in a restaurant where they did not belong. She had the absolute certainty, sitting in her chest like a piece of cold iron, that whatever was about to happen at that corner booth was not going to end with dessert. 8 o'clock. The man by the potted palm looked at his watch one final time, then looked toward the kitchen corridor. Selena was already moving. She grabbed a bottle of Damien Varella's Preferred Red from the rack beneath the bar, a 2014 Barolo she had watched him order 4 times, and she walked across the restaurant floor with the measured pace of a waitress doing exactly what she was supposed to be doing. Past table 7. Past the low murmur of conversation and the clink of silverware and the jazz coming softly from speakers in the ceiling. Past the couple celebrating something at table 9, the woman's ring catching the candlelight. Past all of it. Her heart was doing something terrible inside her chest. She pushed through the velvet curtain. The private dining room was smaller than it looked from outside. The booth curved along the back wall. 4 people seated. Damien at the left end, Elena beside him, then Diane Harmon, then Preston Harmon closest to the wall. A half-eaten ribeye in front of Damien. Elena's salmon barely touched. The champagne Celine had chilled herself 3 hours ago was nearly gone. They all looked up when she entered. "Apologies for the interruption," she said, addressing Damien's end of the table. Her voice came out level. She hated how level it came out because nothing inside her was level. "Would you like me to pour, Mr. Varela?" Damien glanced at the bottle. "Yeah, go ahead." She moved to his side of the table, uncorked the bottle with practiced efficiency, began to pour. Her hand was completely steady. She was very proud of her hand in that moment, and she was also aware that she was running out of seconds. She had a folded piece of paper in the breast pocket of her uniform jacket. She had been carrying it since 7:15. She set the bottle down, straightened, and in the motion of pulling her hand back from the glass, she pressed the folded note beneath Damien Varella's left hand, where it rested on the edge of the table. She felt his fingers tighten slightly as contact registered. "Enjoy your evening," she said to the table. She walked back out through the velvet curtain. Behind her, she heard Elena laugh softly at something her mother said. Celine walked back to the bar, set the corkscrew down, and faced the wall of bottles. She was counting. She didn't know what she was counting toward. The note said, "Run now, armed men inside. This is a setup, at least 7 positions, kitchen, exits, floor. Your wife is the target, not you. Go." She had debated every word for 3 days. She had thought about not writing it at all. Damien Varela was not an innocent man. He had built his organization through violence and maintained it through violence and would probably die in violence of his own making. Celine had no illusions about what he was. But Elena had done nothing. Elena collected orchids and spoke 3 languages and had spent 11 months eating at this restaurant every other Friday because she loved the lighting in the private room and the way the chef prepared her salmon. Elena Harmon had married into a world she didn't fully understand, and tonight that world had been arranged around her like a trap. Celine thought about her brother. She thought about what Daniel would have done. She was not sure. She was not sure about a lot of things Daniel would have done, because she had spent 3 years rewriting him in her memory, and none of those versions were accurate anymore. They were all just grief in different shapes. What she was sure about was that she would not watch another person die in front of her and call it something she couldn't prevent. Behind her, the restaurant shattered. The first shot came from the kitchen corridor, a suppressed crack that was still loud enough to spin 3 nearby diners out of their seats in pure instinct. Then the second, third, fourth in rapid succession, and suddenly the private dining room's frosted glass panel exploded inward, and a man Celine had clocked near the south exit was on his feet with a rifle coming up, and the screaming started all at once like a switch had been thrown. Celine dropped behind the bar. The bar top was heavy oak, 60 years old, thick enough to matter. Marcus was already down. his hands over his head, his eyes finding hers in the chaos with an expression that asked a question she didn't have time to answer. The Bordeaux bottle she had left out was still standing upright. That struck her as absurd. The way one random thing remained untouched in the middle of everything coming apart. She could hear the private dining room from here. A table overturning, something heavy hitting the floor. Damien's voice, not panicked, low and sharp, and giving instructions she couldn't fully make out over the noise. Two of the planted men had converged on the main entrance, cutting off the obvious exit. The man by the potted palm was gone. She scanned for him and found him prone behind an overturned table 12 feet from the private room entrance, rifle up, angled specifically toward the right side of the booth where Elena had been sitting. Not toward Damien's seat, toward Elena's. Celine had already known. She had already written it in the note. But seeing the physical confirmation of it, the precise angle of that rifle, the deliberate positioning, made something cold move through her that wasn't fear exactly. Fear implied uncertainty. This was something that had gone past uncertainty into the territory where the body stops asking questions and just starts moving. She came up from behind the bar in a low run. A chandelier dropped from the ceiling in a cascade of crystal and sparks from a stray round somewhere in the upper wall, and the light in the restaurant lurched and swung and turned everything into strobing shadow. Celine moved through it with the pattern of the room burned into her. She had memorized it. She had memorized every room she worked in for 3 years. That was what survival looked like when you were doing it quietly. She hit the floor near the overturned table where a man and woman in their 60s were crouched and terrified. The couple from table 9, the woman still wearing her new ring. And she grabbed the woman's arm and pushed them both toward the back corridor entrance, the one behind the dessert station that led to the loading dock, the one that was not covered because she had counted 7 men and this route had not been assigned. "Stay low, go straight, door at the end," she said. They went. She did not have a weapon. She had never wanted one before tonight. She had never needed one before tonight because for 3 years the plan had been to stay invisible, stay patient, collect information, feed it to federal contacts through an attorney who owed Daniel's memory a significant debt, and never, never be the person who stepped into the middle of something like this. 3 days ago, the plan had changed. She heard Diane Harmon's voice from somewhere in the private room, a high, broken sound that wasn't screaming but was close to it, and then Preston Harmon's voice underneath it saying something low and urgent and desperate. Celine moved to the doorway of the private room. The scene inside was controlled chaos. Damien had overturned the dining table and was using it as cover. Elena pressed behind him, and he was returning fire with something taken from a shoulder holster that Celine had never noticed in 11 months of watching him, which told her something about how carefully he hid it and what kind of man hid things that carefully. 2 of the attackers were down. The remaining positions were still active and converging. Preston Harmon was standing. That was the thing that stopped Celine for 1/2 second in the doorway. He was standing in the corner of the booth, hands raised slightly, not crouching, not covering, standing like a man waiting for instructions. His wife had her face buried in her hands. Celine filed it, stored it. There would be time for that later, or there wouldn't be any time at all. She caught Damien's eyes across the overturned table. He looked at her with an expression she would spend a long time afterward trying to describe accurately. Not gratitude, that was too simple. Not calculation, though it was partly that. It was the look of a man who had just processed, very rapidly, that this woman who had been pouring his wine for 11 months had just handed him the difference between walking out of this restaurant and being carried out of it, and was now standing in the doorway of a firefight without a weapon and without any cover, and had not yet run. "South corridor," she said. "Loading dock, it's open." He grabbed Elena, pulled her close against his body, keeping himself between her and the remaining gunfire. "Move," he said to her, the single word carrying everything. And Elena moved, folded against him, letting herself be guided without hesitation in the way of someone who had learned to trust his body in situations her mind couldn't process fast enough. Celine went first to confirm the route was clear. Behind her, she heard Damien's footsteps and Elena's, and then, after a beat, the scrambling sounds of Preston and Diane Harmon following, and she thought, good, and then immediately, not yet, and pushed both thoughts down because the loading dock door was 15 seconds ahead and she needed to focus. The door was unlocked. The rain outside was cold and immediate, soaking through her uniform jacket in seconds as they moved into the alley. Two of Damien's security detail materialized from the darkness. She had assumed they existed even though she had never identified them, because a man like Damien Varela did not eat at public restaurants without external security she couldn't see, and they were already on their phones and moving toward the black vehicles parked at the alley's north end. Celine stopped at the edge of the loading dock overhang, where the rain fell in a curtain just beyond her feet. Her hands were shaking. She had not noticed until now. Elena turned back and looked at her from under the rain. Her silver dress was ruined. Her careful hair had come loose. She looked somehow more real this way, disheveled and wet and frightened and breathing too fast, all the careful presentation stripped away by the last 4 minutes. "Who are you?" Elena said. Celine was not sure how to answer that. She had been someone, once. She had been a financial analyst who ran marathons and kept succulents on her windowsill and called her brother every Sunday morning. Then Daniel died, and she had become something else, something with no clean name. "I worked with your brother," she said. It wasn't the complete truth, but it was the truest piece she could offer right then, in the rain, with her hands shaking. Damien stepped between them, not aggressively, just inserting himself the way someone does when they want to control the information flow. He looked at Celine with those eyes that processed everything too quickly. "You're coming with us," he said. It wasn't a question. "I know," she said. She had known before she slipped the note beneath his hand. She had known when she decided at some point in the last 72 hours that she could not exactly identify, that 11 months of watching and waiting and being careful had just become something different, something louder and more dangerous and less controlled. The black vehicles were running. Rain hammered the alley. Damien guided Elena toward the nearest door. His security detail closed around them. Celine walked behind, soaking wet, her crystal polishing cloth still tucked in her jacket pocket because she hadn't had a moment to leave it behind. She looked back once at the service entrance of Valerio's steakhouse. Through the narrow window in the door, the restaurant interior was visible. Overturned furniture, broken glass, the swinging chandelier she had watched fall. Sirens in the distance now, moving closer. Somewhere in that building, the man by the potted palm was either gone or dead. The Bordeaux bottle was probably still standing on the bar, untouched. She did not know yet what was inside the evidence she had been collecting for 3 years. She did not know what Damien would do when he found out. She did not know if she had just saved Elena Varela's life or simply delayed the inevitable by an evening. She knew that her anonymity was finished. She knew that 3 years of careful, invisible work had ended the moment her fingers pressed that note into a crime lord's hand. She knew that the people who had arranged tonight's attack were already aware by now that something had gone wrong, and that something had a face and a name and an employment record at Valerio's steakhouse. She climbed into the vehicle. The door closed. The city moved past the rain-streaked window, neon blurring in the dark. In the seat across from her, Elena Varela held her husband's hand with both of hers and stared at the floor between her feet and said nothing at all. Her breathing was careful and deliberate, the breathing of someone who has decided that falling apart is not permitted yet. Celine recognized it. She had been doing the same thing for 3 years. Between them, in the cramped back seat of an armored vehicle racing through the wet streets of Black Hollow, Preston Harmon sat with his hands folded in his lap and his eyes down. His hands were not shaking. Celine had noticed that on the loading dock and she had filed it away, and now, in the moving darkness of the vehicle, she looked at those still, folded hands and felt the cold iron certainty in her chest rearrange itself into something new and worse. Outside, the city's lights fragmented in the rain, and the sirens grew distant, and the night kept moving, indifferent, already forgetting the sound of broken glass and the way the chandelier had swung in the dark restaurant like something searching for what it had lost. Celine pressed her shaking hands flat against her thighs and breathed and thought about what was going to happen when they arrived at wherever they were going. What was going to happen when Damien Varela asked her what she knew? What was going to happen when she told him? The safe house was 40 minutes outside of Black Hollow, in a neighborhood that had no name on any map Celine had ever seen. Just a grid of identical streets lined with industrial buildings that looked abandoned from the outside and probably were, except for this one, which sat behind a chain-link fence topped with razor wire and had 3 cameras visible on the exterior and at least 2 more she assumed existed that she couldn't see. They had switched vehicles twice on the way. The first switch happened in a parking garage on the east side of the city, fast and practiced. Doors opening before the cars fully stopped, everyone moving in the dark between SUVs while Damien's men said nothing and communicated in gestures and short directional touches on shoulders and arms. The second switch happened in an alley behind a tire warehouse, and this time Celine was separated briefly from the Harmons and put in a different vehicle than them, which she accepted without protest because protesting would have been stupid, and she was trying very hard not to be stupid tonight. She was not fully succeeding. The inside of the safe house smelled like concrete and machine oil and the particular staleness of climate-controlled air that had been recycled too many times. Fluorescent lights overhead, exposed ductwork, a long table in the main room with folding chairs around it, a bank of monitors along one wall showing feeds from at least a dozen external cameras, and a kitchenette in the back corner that had a coffee maker and nothing else that suggested comfort. Damien's security lead, a man named Rourke, broad through the shoulders, a jaw like a piece of quarried stone, had done a full sweep of the building by the time they arrived. He met Damien at the entrance with 3 words. "It's clean, secure." Damien nodded once and moved inside. Elena had not let go of his hand since the loading dock. She let go of it now only because she had to. Because a woman on Damien's team, compact and dark-haired, appeared from a side room and guided her gently but firmly toward what turned out to be a bathroom, and Elena went because she needed a moment that wasn't in front of all these people. Celine heard the faucet running a minute later. She heard it run for a long time. The Harmons were seated at the long table. Celine stood against the wall nearest the door, which she recognized as instinct more than strategy. She had been putting herself near exits for 3 years. Her uniform jacket was still wet from the rain. The crystal polishing cloth in her pocket was soaked through. She became briefly, absurdly aware that she was still wearing her work name tag. "Celine, ask me anything." She pulled it off and put it in her pocket. Damien stood at the head of the table and looked at his in-laws. Preston Harmon had aged visibly in the 40 minutes since Valerio's. The careful performance of a dinner party had completely dissolved. He looked like what he was, a man in his late 60s who was very frightened and who had been very frightened for a long time before tonight, and had been managing it through some internal architecture that had just given way. Diane Harmon sat beside him with her arms wrapped around herself, staring at the surface of the table, her champagne-colored blazer still immaculate in a way that seemed wrong, given everything that had happened. She had not spoken since the loading dock. She had not looked at her husband. Damien didn't sit. He stood with his hands on the back of the chair at the table's head and looked at them the way a man looks at something he's trying to decide what to do with. "Tell me," he said. Preston looked up. "Damien." "Don't say my name like we're about to have a conversation," Damien said. "Tell me what tonight was." The silence stretched. Somewhere in the building, a generator hummed. Celine watched Preston Harmon's hands on the table's surface. Still. She kept coming back to that. The stillness of them. It wasn't supposed to go the way it... Preston stopped, started again. "We were told you would be the target." The room did not change temperature, but it felt like it did. Damien's jaw worked once. "Say that again." "They told us..." Preston's voice broke on the word, and he pushed through it, the way old men push through things because stopping feels worse. "They told us the target was you, that Elena would be safe, that she would be..." "Safe." Damien said the word like he was picking it up off the floor and examining the damage to it. "They said she would be removed from the situation before..." "Before what?" Not a question. A wall. Preston put his face in his hands. Celine pushed off from the wall. She had not planned to speak. She spoke anyway. "The gunmen's angles," she said. "Did you tell them where Elena would be sitting? Which side of the booth?" Everyone looked at her. She had almost forgotten that most of the people in this room did not yet know who she was or why she was here. Damien looked at her with an expression that meant, "Continue." "I tracked the positions when they were setting up," she said, addressing Damien directly because he was the one who mattered right now. 7 men. I mapped their firing lines in my head. None of the primary angles pointed toward your seat. They all converged on the right side of the booth. She paused. Elena's side. The fluorescent light buzzed overhead. Diane Harmon made a sound that was not quite a sob. It was something worse, the sound of a person who has been containing something enormous and has just lost the ability to contain it. Preston lifted his face from his hands. His eyes were red. We were supposed to. They said if we kept the seating arrangement as planned, kept everyone in position until 8 o'clock. They said it was about sending a message to you, not... Stop talking, Damien said. Preston stopped. Damien straightened. He put both hands flat on the table and leaned forward and spoke very quietly, which was somehow much worse than if he had shouted. You sat across from my wife for 2 hours. You drank champagne with her. You helped arrange the room so that men with rifles could... He stopped himself. His breathing was audible. You sat there. We didn't have a choice, Diane said. It was the first thing she had said since they arrived. Her voice was remarkably steady. There were people watching our house. They had photographs of our grandchildren. They said if we didn't... You have no grandchildren, Damien said. Elena's cousin's children. The Mercer kids. They had photographs, Damien. They had names and school schedules, and they told us that if we didn't... She pressed her lips together. We didn't have a choice. Everyone has a choice, Celine said from the wall. Diane turned to look at her. Who are you? Someone who made one tonight. That's... Diane shook her head. You don't understand what these people are capable of. I understand exactly what they're capable of, Celine said. My brother worked for them, and they killed him anyway. After everything he did for them, after everything he gave up. They killed him anyway because that's what they do. They take what they need, and they eliminate the liability. Her voice was level. She needed it to be level. They were always going to kill your daughter. The debt doesn't go away. It just changes shape. The room was silent. Preston Harmon looked at Celine with the expression of a man who has just heard something he already knew and had been working very hard not to know. The bathroom door opened. Elena came out. She had washed her face and pulled her hair back again with something, a rubber band from her wrist, it looked like. And she had done something with her expression that Celine recognized as performance, the particular arrangement of features that means I'm holding myself together and I need you to not challenge that right now. She looked at her parents. She looked at her husband. She read the room in about 2 seconds. What did I miss? She said. No one answered. Elena looked at her mother, then at her father, then back at Damien. What did I miss? She said again. Slower. Damien straightened. Sit down, Elena. Don't tell me to sit down. Please sit down. She did not sit down. She stayed in the doorway with her arms at her sides and her chin up and her eyes moving between her parents and her husband, and Celine watched her work it out in real time. The pieces assembling themselves against her will, the way understanding arrives sometimes not like a revelation, but like a series of small confirmations of something you didn't want confirmed. Tell me, Elena said. To her parents. Not to Damien. Preston couldn't look at her. That was its own answer. Elena's arms dropped to her sides. She stood very still for a moment. Then she walked to the table and sat down in the chair at the opposite end from Damien, as far from her parents as the table allowed, and she folded her hands in her lap and looked at the surface of the table and breathed. Damien watched her. Give us the room, he said to Rourke. Rourke moved the security team out. Celine started toward the door. Damien said, Not you, and she stopped. She stood against the wall while Damien moved to Elena and crouched beside her chair and spoke to her in a voice too low for Celine to hear. Elena's hands tightened in her lap. She nodded once, the single nod of someone receiving information they need but didn't want. Damien stood. He looked at Celine. You said your brother worked for them. He worked in their financial operations, accounting, moving money. His name? Daniel Vey. Something shifted in Damien's expression. Not recognition exactly, but the particular quality of a man rearranging information he already possessed. Vey, he said. He died 3 years ago. Car accident, according to the police report. She said it flatly. It wasn't an accident. You've been building a case. I've been building leverage. She chose the word deliberately. There's a difference. A case requires things that can be challenged in court. Leverage just requires the right information reaching the right people at the right moment. Damien studied her. You've been at Valerio's 11 months. Yes. Watching me. Watching the patterns. You were part of the pattern. And you warned me tonight instead of letting it happen. She met his eyes. I wasn't going to let her die. You don't know her. I know what it looks like when someone doesn't deserve what's coming to them. Elena made a sound from the end of the table. Something small and involuntary that she cut off immediately. Her hands were still folded. Her knuckles were white. Damien said to Celine, "What do you have?" I have 3 years of financial records documenting the Volkov Syndicate's debt arrangements across the city, client lists, transaction records, the names of at least 17 public officials tied to payments made through the syndicate's shell companies. She paused. And I have the direct communication chain between the Volkov Enforcement Division and the federal agent who buried my brother's case. The room was very quiet. How long have you had the federal contact? Damien said. 8 months. And you didn't move on it. I was waiting for the full picture. You were waiting, he said, and there was something in how he said it that she couldn't quite categorize. Not condemnation, not admiration, something in between that felt like the acknowledgement of a choice made at personal cost. Where is the documentation now? Encrypted. 3 separate servers. 2 domestic, 1 in a jurisdiction that will take the relevant agencies approximately 4 years to subpoena. She had thought about this carefully, and for a long time. Copies with my attorney. Access keys with someone I trust who is not in this city. You really thought this through. I had to. I was doing it alone. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he walked to the bank of monitors and said something into his earpiece, and Rourke appeared almost immediately with a laptop that he set on the table. The restaurant, Damien said. Show me the footage. Rourke pulled it up. Security feeds from Valerio's own system, which his team had apparently accessed remotely in the time since the shooting. Multiple angles, the private dining room, the main floor, the kitchen corridor. They watched. It was a different experience, watching violence that you had lived through from the outside. Celine watched herself cross the restaurant floor with the Barolo. She watched her own hands, steady and precise, complete the pour. She watched the fractional moment when the note passed between her fingers and Damien's, invisible to every camera angle, which she had calculated in advance. She watched Damien read it. She watched the micro-change in his posture. Not panic, not even visible alarm, just a slight realignment of his whole body that an untrained observer would have missed. She watched him make the decision to believe it in about 2 seconds. Then the kitchen corridor erupted, and the footage turned into something she had no desire to watch twice, but watched anyway because Damien needed to watch it, and she was not going to look away. Stop, Damien said. Rourke froze the frame. It was the shooting angle from the man near the potted palm. Frozen on screen, the rifle barrel was visible in the lower frame, and the projection of that angle, even partially obscured by distance and camera position, pointed with unmistakable clarity toward the right side of the corner booth, toward the seat Elena had occupied. Elena had come to stand beside Damien at some point without Celine noticing. She was looking at the screen. Her face was entirely still. Celine had seen that kind of stillness before, not in people who were calm, but in people who were far past the point where emotion has a shape, where feeling has gone so large it no longer fits any recognizable expression. Dad, Elena said. Preston Harmon had been watching the footage from his seat. He looked up. Is that where I was sitting? Elena said. It wasn't a question. She knew where she had been sitting. Preston opened his mouth. Don't. Elena's voice broke cleanly on the single syllable, and she stopped and pressed her fingers against her mouth and breathed through it. When she spoke again, her voice was quieter but controlled. Don't explain it right now. I'm asking you a yes or no question, and I want you to answer it. The silence was almost physical. Yes, Preston Harmon said. Elena turned away from the screen. She walked back to her chair at the end of the table and sat down again, and no one in the room said anything. The next 2 hours were operational. Damien worked the phones and the secure laptop with a focused intensity that had nothing performative about it. Just the mechanical efficiency of a man who has processed the worst information and filed it somewhere that won't interfere with function. Celine sat across from Rourke and walked him through the 7 positions she had identified in the restaurant, the physical descriptions of each man she could provide, the timing of their arrival relative to the Harmon reservation. Rourke recorded everything in a way that suggested the information would be useful to specific people for specific purposes she did not ask about. At some point, Diane Harmon asked for water, and a young man Celine hadn't noticed before appeared from the kitchenette with a glass. Preston did not ask for anything. He sat with his hands on the table and stared at the middle distance and performed a private accounting of something that showed on his face as plain as weather. Elena sat at the end of the table and did not look at her parents and did not speak. Around 11:30, Damien set the laptop aside and looked at Celine. The Volkov contact at the federal level. What agency? Financial Crimes Division. Agent named Croft. He filed the accident report on Daniel's death personally. The paper trail showing contact between Croft and the syndicate goes back at least 6 years. Croft is still active? Last confirmed, yes. So anything your attorney forwards through normal channels has a non-trivial chance of landing on a desk next to his, she finished, which is why I've been moving slowly. You need the filing to go around him, not through. Damien looked at Rourke. Something passed between them that Celine couldn't read. I know someone, Damien said. Not in Croft's chain, different division. I've had use for her before. Her name? You'll have it when I decide that's the next step. Celine nodded. Fair enough. She was operating in his territory now, and she understood what that meant. From the far end of the table, Elena said, I want to see the files. Damien looked at her. The ones she's been collecting, Elena said, without looking at Celine. About my parents, about what they owe and to whom. I want to see all of it. Elena, I'm not asking for your permission, she said. I'm telling you what I want. Celine leaned forward. I can get the files remotely within the hour. It's your call what she sees. Show her, Damien said, after a moment that cost him something. Celine used Rourke's laptop and a secure tunnel to access the first archive. Daniel's financial records were organized the way his mind had worked. Meticulous, layered, cross-referenced. She navigated to the Harmon file and turned the screen toward Elena. Elena read. She scrolled slowly. She went back twice to sections she had read already, reading them again. Her face showed nothing. She read for nearly 20 minutes. When she was done, she pushed the laptop back across the table and sat with her hands flat on the surface. The interest rate, she said, 400% annually. Standard for the syndicate's distressed debt arrangements, Celine said. They've been paying them for 4 years. According to the records, they've been paying and it never went down. It's structured so it can't. Every payment covers less than the new interest accumulation. They've been running in place for 4 years toward a debt that was always going to be used as leverage rather than collected. Celine paused. Daniel identified at least 39 families in the same structure across the city. The debt isn't the goal. The compliance is. Elena looked at her parents. Preston Harmon was already looking at his daughter. He had been looking at her since she started reading, the way a person looks at something they know is the last time. How long? Elena said. Preston looked at his hands. How long have you known that I specifically was the target? The silence was different now. Before, the silences had been filled with the sound of people managing themselves. This one was empty. Just the hum of the generator and the rain that Celine could hear faintly against the building's high windows and the breathing of everyone in the room. 4 days, Preston said. The word landed in the room like something dropped from a height. Elena inhaled, just barely visible. The lift of her chest, the compression. She didn't speak for a long moment. 4 days, she said. We had dinner on Tuesday. Elena! We had dinner on Tuesday. You came to the apartment and Elena made that lamb dish you like, and we talked about the Mercer kids' school play, and you looked... Her voice was carefully neutral, and somehow that was the worst version of it. You looked fine. We were trying to protect you. By delivering me to the table on time, she said. Preston flinched. By making sure I sat where they needed me to sit. We thought, Diane began. Stop, Elena said. I don't want to hear what you thought. I want to. She stopped, pressed her hands flat on the table. I need to not be in this room. She stood, walked to the door that led deeper into the building, stopped with her hand on the frame, didn't turn around. Damien, she said. Yeah. Don't kill them. The room held its breath. What I want, she said very quietly, is to never see them again. Can you arrange that? Damien looked at his in-laws, at Preston's devastated, crumpled face, at Diane's rigid, contained posture, with an expression that Celine could not read and suspected nobody in the room could read. It was the face of a man doing math in a private language. I can arrange that, he said. Elena nodded once, walked out of the room. The door did not slam. That was almost worse. The careful, deliberate click of a latch settling into place. Damien stood still for a moment. Then he turned to Rourke. Put them somewhere comfortable, separate rooms, nobody leaves. He picked up the laptop. Get me Calder. Tell her it's time. He walked out without looking at the Harmons again. Celine stood alone at the wall with Preston and Diane Harmon sitting at the long table, and she looked at them. At this ordinary pair of frightened, wealthy, compromised people who had sat across a dinner table from their daughter and done arithmetic with her life and come out on the wrong side of it. And she thought about Daniel, about the last voicemail he had left her 3 years ago, the one she had listened to so many times she had worn grooves in it. He had sounded tired. He had sounded like someone who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and could feel himself starting to drop it. She had called him back the next morning and gotten nothing. You knew enough, Celine said. Diane looked up at her. Whatever they told you, whatever you convinced yourselves about targets and plans and what would and wouldn't happen, you knew enough. She wasn't angry. That was the strange thing. 3 years ago she would have been. Now she just felt the weight of it, flat and heavy. And you sat there. Preston Harmon looked at his folded hands. Rourke appeared in the doorway. They're ready to move, he said to Celine. Then, to the Harmons, come with me. They stood. They did not look at each other. They walked toward the door like people moving through water. At the threshold, Preston stopped. He looked back at Celine. His eyes were the eyes of a man who has arrived somewhere he cannot leave. He opened his mouth. Celine shook her head once. He closed it again. Walked out. She was alone in the room. The monitors still showed the camera feeds from a dozen exterior angles. The fence, the dark street, the rain falling through the frame like static. The laptop was still open on the table, Daniel's files glowing on the screen. She walked over and looked at them. His handwriting in the margin of a scanned document. Daniel had always annotated by hand first, then transferred the notes digitally, a habit she had teased him about. Old man habit, she had said once. Dinosaur behavior. He had laughed. She closed the laptop. Behind her, Damien Varela appeared in the doorway. He had changed into something that wasn't a bullet-torn dinner suit. Dark clothes, practical. He was holding 2 cups of coffee from the kitchenette, and he set one on the table near her without comment. Calder is my contact at the Inspector General's office, he said. She's been building a parallel case on Financial Crimes Division corruption for 2 years. Croft is on her list, but she's been missing the connection to the syndicate's ground-level operations. He looked at the closed laptop. Your files provide that connection. And what do you get out of this arrangement? Celine asked. The organization that tried to execute my wife in front of her own parents gets dismantled from the inside out. He picked up his own coffee. Also, I'd prefer not to spend the next decade watching my back for whatever Victor Sorin decides to send next. Victor Sorin, she said the name. The Volkov leadership. The man who gave the order tonight. Damien looked at her steadily. You have his name in your files. I have his name in my files. Then we have a conversation to finish, he said, about how this ends. She picked up the coffee. It was too hot to drink comfortably, and she drank it anyway because she had been cold since the loading dock, and possibly longer than that. Through the high windows, the rain kept falling on the industrial dark outside. And somewhere in the city, Celine knew, Victor Sorin was looking at the wreckage of tonight's operation, at the 8 o'clock window that had passed without the confirmed kill, and he was doing his own accounting, his own arithmetic, He was working out what had gone wrong, and who had made it go wrong, and what needed to happen. The conversation about how it ends lasted until 2 in the morning. Celine had spread Daniel's files across the long table. Not the digital copies, but the physical ones. The originals she had retrieved from the waterproof case she kept in a storage unit 6 blocks from Valerio's, which Rourke had collected on her instruction during the vehicle switch. Printed pages and handwritten annotations and photographs and transaction records spanning 3 years of her brother's life and 3 years of her own work after it, all of it laid out under the fluorescent lights while Damien stood across the table and read, with the focused attention of a man who understood what he was looking at. He asked good questions. Celine had not expected that, or rather she had expected useful questions, operational questions, and instead got questions that suggested he was thinking 3 moves ahead of the operational. Who else has seen this specific page? When was this account opened relative to the Mercer enforcement action? This signature, is it consistent across all the documents or just the ones from this period? Questions that told her he was looking for the shape of the thing, not just the contents. She answered everything. Around midnight, Elena appeared from the back of the building. She had changed into clothes that someone had produced for her. Dark sweater, plain trousers, and she sat at the far end of the table with a cup of tea she didn't drink and listened to everything without asking to be included or excluded. Damien glanced at her once. She looked back at him with an expression that said she was staying, and the expression was not negotiable. He returned to the documents. At 1:45, Rourke came in and set a phone on the table in front of Damien. "Called her," he said. Damien picked it up and walked to the far corner of the room. His half of the conversation was minimal. "Yes, no, I understand, the files are real. I'll send Rourke with a sample set tomorrow morning." When he came back, his face had the look of someone who has just confirmed a calculation they had been running in their head. "She's interested," he said. "Interested or committed?" Celine said. "For tonight, interested. Committed comes when she sees the material." He looked at the spread of documents. "We need to give her enough to move on Croft without giving her everything at once. If she moves on Croft before the full case is built, he runs, I know." Damien's voice was flat. "We thread the needle. Enough to freeze his access, not enough to spook him into disappearing." He looked at her. "Can you identify which documents most directly tie him to the syndicate's enforcement operations?" "Yes." "Do that. Tonight." She did it. It took 90 minutes and 2 cups of the bad kitchenette coffee and the specific focused exhaustion of a person working at the intersection of grief and purpose, which Celine had been living in for 3 years and which felt different now, sharper somehow, the way a familiar pain changes quality when the thing causing it finally starts to move. By the time she finished, the building had gone quiet around her. The security team moved in shifts, always present but cycling. Elena had fallen asleep in the chair at the end of the table, her head at an uncomfortable angle against her own shoulder. Damien had laid his jacket over her without waking her and stood looking at her for a moment with his hands in his pockets and a face that had no performance in it at all. Just a man looking at his wife who was alive, processing the specific arithmetic of that. Celine looked away. Some things were not meant to be witnessed. She slept for 3 hours on a cot in a side room and woke up to the sound of raised voices. She was on her feet before she was fully conscious, the way that 3 years of careful living had trained her body to respond. She was in the doorway of the main room in seconds, and what she found was Rourke and a man she did not recognize standing at the monitor bank with their backs to her, and Damien at the table with a laptop open, and a quality in the room that she cataloged immediately as wrongness, the particular atmosphere that descends when information has arrived that changes the shape of something. "What happened?" she said. Damien looked at her. His face was careful in a way that meant he was managing something. "Sit down. Tell me first." "Celine." She came to the table, looked at the laptop screen. It showed a document, formatted like an internal communication, the header redacted but the structure recognizable as Federal Interagency Correspondence. Her name was in the 3rd paragraph. She read it. She read it twice. The document was dated 4 months ago. It outlined an informal information sharing arrangement between an asset identified by the initials SV and a handler within the Financial Crimes Division. The asset had been providing periodic intelligence on organized crime operations in the Black Hollow metro area. The handler was listed only by badge number. Celine felt the floor of the room become uncertain in a way that had nothing to do with her physical balance. "Where did this come from?" she said. "Calder sent it 20 minutes ago. It was in a file she pulled when she started building the background on your documentation." Damien's voice was neutral, in the careful way of someone who is withholding judgment at personal cost. "She said it came up in a routine cross-reference when she ran your brother's name." "My brother's name." "The asset listed is not Daniel Vey." He paused. "The badge number on the handler belongs to Croft." Celine stood at the table and looked at the document and felt her understanding of the last 8 months rearrange itself around her in real time, slowly, the way very large things collapse, not all at once, but in sequence, each piece taking the next one with it. "The attorney," she said, "the one I've been routing the documents through. Calder is running him now. His name is Wren, Marcus Wren. He's been practicing for—" "Calder will find him." Damien watched her. "Celine." She looked up. "I need to know if you had any direct contact with anyone in the Financial Crimes Division that you did not tell me about last night." "No." "Any communication that could have been intercepted? Email? Phone?" "I used encrypted channels. I've been using encrypted channels for 3 years." She heard her own voice from a slight distance, the dissociation that comes when the mind is working too fast for the body to keep pace. The attorney was supposed to be the buffer. The whole architecture assumed Wren was clean. "When did you first contact him?" 8 months ago. He was referred to me by a woman who used to work with Daniel, a paralegal named Bess who left the firm before Daniel died. I trusted the referral because—" She stopped. The sentence had a place it was going that she did not want to follow. "Because Daniel trusted Bess." Damien said nothing. "Daniel trusted Bess," Celine said again, and this time she heard what was underneath it. "How long has the document been active? The handler arrangement." "The date on the document is 4 months ago, but Calder says the file structure suggests the relationship predates the formal documentation." "By how much?" "She doesn't know yet." Celine sat down. She had not planned to sit. Her legs made the decision without consulting her. She put her hands flat on the table the way she had watched Elena do it the night before, the gesture of a person imposing physical order on a moment that has lost all other order. 8 months. She had been feeding documents to Marcus Wren for 8 months. Wren had been in contact with Croft, which meant that for 8 months, the man she had spent 3 years trying to build a case against had been receiving a curated version of her evidence, enough to know what she had, not enough to fully expose him, because Wren would have known to manage the flow, to drip it carefully. Enough to know who she was, enough to know what she was doing, enough to have arranged something about it, if he had wanted to. He hadn't. That was the thing that stopped her in the middle of the unraveling. He had known about her for potentially 8 months, and he had not moved against her, which meant either she had been too small to bother with, possible, she had been careful, she had stayed anonymous, or she had been more useful to him intact than eliminated, or he had been waiting, positioning. "The attack last night," she said. Damien was ahead of her. "The timing. If Croft knew about my documentation, if he knew I was at Valerio's, if he knew you were connected to the harm and debt situation through Elena." She pressed her fingers against her mouth and thought. The attack wasn't just about Elena. It wasn't just about sending a message to the syndicate's debtors. "If you died in a restaurant shooting during an organized crime incident," Damien said, "your files become evidence in a federal investigation controlled by the man who is running you as an asset. And everything I spent 3 years building goes through Croft's hands. Every copy, every encrypted server. Your attorney would know the access architecture. Wren would know the access architecture." She felt something cold move through her that was beyond fear. It was the specific vertigo of understanding that the trap had been larger than the room she was standing in. "He would know how to approach my contact about the keys. He would know everything I had built to protect the files could be reframed as evidence management by a compromised source. And Daniel's case stays buried," Damien said, "permanently." The generator hummed. The rain had stopped at some point while she slept, and the absence of it made the building feel more exposed, the silence outside pressing against the high windows. Elena's voice came from the end of the table. Did she know? Celine looked up. Elena had been awake. Had been awake for how long, sitting in the corner with Damien's jacket in her lap, her face unreadable. About her attorney. Did she know he was compromised? No, Damien said. I'm asking her. Celine met Elena's eyes. No, I didn't know. Elena held her gaze for a moment. Then she nodded, the single nod of someone extending a provisional form of belief, and looked back at the table's surface. Rourke appeared. He set another phone on the table, different from the first one. Calder found Wren. Damien picked up the phone. Celine watched his face as he listened, and the thing she saw was not anger. Anger was what she had expected, the kind of controlled fury she had watched him direct at the Harmons the night before. What she saw instead was worse. It was the expression of a man absorbing information that doesn't surprise him, which was somehow more frightening than if it had. He put the phone down. Wren is dead, he said. The word landed wrong in Celine's chest, not grief. She had met Marcus Wren 4 times. She had found him careful and competent, and slightly too smooth in a way she had attributed to legal professional habit. Not grief, but the specific nausea of a death that tells you something. When? She said. 3 days ago, found in his car outside his office, filed as a suicide. He didn't. Calder doesn't think so either. Damien looked at her steadily. Someone cleaned up the information channel before tonight, before the attack. He let that settle. Which means the operation at Valerio's wasn't improvised. It was the back end of something that had been running for months. Celine thought about that. She laid it against everything she knew. She turned it over and looked at its underside and felt her hands start to shake again beneath the table where no one could see them, and pressed them hard against her thighs. The files, she said. If Wren is dead and Croft knows the access architecture, have the servers been accessed? I need to check. Rourke was already moving the laptop toward her. She logged in with fingers that did not shake because she would not let them. The first server, domestic, routed through a proxy chain she had built over 6 months, showed normal access logs. The second server showed the same. She went to the third, the offshore one, the one in the jurisdiction that should have taken 4 years to reach. The third server's last access timestamp was 41 hours ago, from an IP address that was not hers. Celine stared at the screen. Someone accessed the third archive, she said. Her voice came out very quiet. 41 hours ago. What's on that server? The direct communication logs between Croft and the syndicate, the most sensitive material, the things I kept isolated specifically because... She stopped. Because they were the ones that could not be explained away as circumstantial. Are they still there? They're there. The access log shows read only. Nothing was deleted. She looked up. But they know what they're looking at now, and they know I know they accessed it. Rourke said from the monitor bank. We've got movement. Everyone turned. The exterior camera feed showed 3 vehicles on the industrial street outside, moving slowly, not the speed of traffic, the speed of approach. They found us, Rourke said. The words were entirely without inflection, the statement of a man reporting weather. Damien looked at the feeds for 3 seconds. Then he looked at Celine. How many people know the location of this safe house? I don't know your operational security, she said. How many people did you tell? No one. I didn't know where we were going until we arrived. Wren, Damien said, not to Celine, to Rourke. If Wren had access to her communications architecture, he could have had a tap on her device, Rourke said. Location services. We ran the sweep when she came in, but if it was hardware level, it doesn't matter now, Damien said. He was already moving. How many vehicles do we have? 2 in the rear bay. Third is still in the city. Rear exit viable? For another 4 minutes. Damien turned to Elena. She was already on her feet. Not panicked, just standing, waiting. The look of a woman who has processed that waiting for instructions is currently the most useful thing she can do. He crossed to her in 3 steps and took her face in his hands and said something too quiet for Celine to hear, and Elena nodded, and he let go. Get her out, he said to the woman from the bathroom, whose name Celine still did not know, and the woman was already moving, taking Elena toward the rear bay with the efficiency of someone who has rehearsed this. Celine stood. The vehicles outside had stopped. All three of them, at staggered positions along the street that she recognized as tactical coverage. Same logic as the men at Valerio's. Same organizational signature. Not improvised, not reactive. Patient, positioned, waiting for the moment to be right. "They're not moving," one of Rourke's team said from the monitors. "Just holding." "They're waiting for something," Celine said. Damien looked at her. "They're not rushing because they think they have us contained." She made herself think through it, made herself use the 3 years of pattern reading rather than the fear that was sitting in her sternum like a fist. They accessed the server 41 hours ago. They knew about Ren. They've been running this longer than tonight. She looked at the camera feeds. 3 vehicles, holding, patient. They're not trying to kill us right now. They want the files. They want to know what I gave you and what you plan to do with it. "You're telling me they want to negotiate," Damien said. "I'm telling you they want leverage. They've always wanted leverage. That's the whole—" She stopped. Something was assembling in her mind with the slow, grinding certainty of a mechanism that has been given the right final piece. That's what Daniel was for. He wasn't just handling their finances. He was building something for them. A leverage archive. Records of everyone who owed them, everyone who had taken their money, everyone who could be threatened. And when he decided to build his own copy, when he started collecting it for himself, they found out. "And killed him for it," Damien said. "They killed him for it, but they kept the archive. They've been using it ever since." She looked at the monitor feeds, at the 3 patient vehicles in the dark street. "Victor Sorin doesn't just run a criminal organization. He runs a city. Half the people in your files are in his files. The debt arrangements, the official contacts, the federal corruption. It's all part of the same system." She felt the shape of it now. Finally, fully, the shape she had been chasing for 3 years without quite being able to see all of it at once. "He doesn't want us dead tonight. He wants to know how much we have and whether it can be managed." Damien was quiet for a moment. "And if it can't be managed?" Then he stops being patient. From outside, very clearly, a phone on the table began to ring. Everyone in the room looked at it. It was one of Rourke's secure lines, the kind that were not supposed to receive incoming calls from outside the team's internal network, the kind of line that should have been impossible to reach unless you already knew how to reach it. Rourke looked at Damien. Damien looked at the phone. Celine said, "Don't answer it." "If I don't answer it," Damien said, "we're already in the next phase of this." "If you answer it," she said, "you're telling him that his architecture works, that he can reach you when he wants to reach you, that the information he's been gathering about your operations for—" She paused, the next thought arriving with a specific, sickening weight, "for however long he's been building toward this." The phone rang. Rourke said quietly, "The vehicles are still holding." Damien reached out and picked up the phone. He looked at Celine for one beat, the look of a man who has chosen a direction and is acknowledging the cost of it. And then he answered. "Varela," he said. The voice on the other end was audible to no one but him. Celine watched his face and read nothing, and found that more frightening than anything she had seen in the past 24 hours. Whatever Damien Varela was hearing, he had gone somewhere internal that left his face completely neutral. Not controlled, not managing, but blank in the specific way that meant the thing being said was large enough that all his normal machinery had suspended itself to process it. He listened for 40 seconds without speaking. Then he said, "Where?" and listened again and said, "Alone," and ended the call. He put the phone down. He stood with his hand resting on it and looked at the table surface. The room waited. "Victor Sorin wants a meeting," he said. "Don't," Celine said immediately. "Tomorrow night. He's chosen the location." "Damien, this is exactly how he said he has something of mine." He looked up from the table. His eyes found Celine's, and she saw in them something she had not seen in the last 24 hours. Something that the violence at Valerio's and the confrontation with the Harmons and the unraveling of her own intelligence architecture had not produced. Something that looked, beneath the controlled surface of it, like the specific terror of a man who has just been handed information about something he cannot lose. "He said he has Elena's location," Damien said, "the vehicle she left in. He said he's had it since the safe house." The room was very still. Celine looked at the monitor feeds. The three vehicles were still there, patient in the dark street, holding, not attacking. Demonstrating, she understood now with perfect clarity that they could, that they had been able to this entire time, that the entire night, the attack at Valerio's, the safe house compromise, the server access, the impossible call to a secure line, the three vehicles outside, had not been a series of escalating hostile actions. It had been a demonstration. Victor Sorin had spent the last 24 hours showing Damien Varela exactly how thoroughly he had been surrounded. And now he wanted a meeting. Celine looked at Damien and understood that the 3 years she had spent building toward this moment, the careful architecture, the isolated servers, the trusted referrals and encrypted channels, and anonymous patients, had not been dismantled by accident or bad luck or the random cruelty of the world. Someone had been watching her build it, and had let her finish because a completed trap was more useful than an interrupted one, and she had spent 3 years constructing the most elaborate and comprehensive case against Victor Sorin that had ever existed, and she had just handed. Damien put his phone in his pocket and looked at the wall for 4 seconds. Celine counted them. She had developed the habit of counting things that could be counted when everything else was outside her control. 4 seconds. Then he turned. Rourke, get me eyes on Elena's vehicle. Already trying. Rourke was at the monitor bank, fingers moving. GPS on the transport went dark 22 minutes ago. How? Signal blocked or device pulled. Either way, he stopped. The way he stopped said enough. Damien's jaw moved once. That was the only visible sign. Who was driving? Teller. And Sao. Try Teller's personal. Done. No answer. The room absorbed this. Celine looked at the exterior feeds, the 3 vehicles still holding in the dark street, patient as appointments. She thought about what kind of organization ran an operation at this level of complexity. She thought about Daniel, who had worked inside that organization for 4 years and had seen its full architecture from inside and had been frightened enough to start building a private record of everything he saw. Had been frightened enough, at the end, to try to leave. She thought about the fact that he had been frightened and had left anyway, or tried to. And she thought about what that said about the size of what he was willing to carry. The meeting, she said. Damien looked at her. He's not going to hurt her before the meeting. She's leverage, which means she's only useful intact. She made herself say it cleanly, without the emotional padding that would have made it easier to hear. He wants the meeting. He wants you there. And he wants you scared enough to come alone. I know. You can't go alone. I know that too. Then we need to talk about what this actually is. She moved to the table and pulled the laptop toward her. Her hands were steady now. The shaking had stopped somewhere in the last 10 minutes, replaced by a peculiar cold clarity that she recognized as the body's response to necessity. He didn't call you to negotiate a truce. He called you because he wants to see what you do when you're afraid. He wants to see your decision-making under maximum pressure. That's intelligence gathering. Or he wants to kill me in person, Damien said. If he wanted you dead tonight, you'd be dead. The vehicles are still holding. He had Elena's transport tagged before she left this building, which means he had capability he hasn't deployed. She looked at him. He's not finished demonstrating things yet. Damien stood in the center of the room with his hands at his sides and his face doing the work of containing whatever was happening behind it. Celine had watched him for 11 months from across a restaurant, and she had categorized him as dangerous, controlled, and intelligent. Those assessments had not changed. What had changed was her understanding of what those qualities looked like from inside a crisis rather than observed from a distance. He was not handling this well in the way of someone performing competence. He was handling it by moving through each decision as it arrived, which was the only real way to handle anything. Calder, he said. She can't move fast enough, not on Elena. Celine shook her head. Anything through official channels takes time they've already planned for. The server access, Ren, the compromised safe house, they've been anticipating a federal response. They have people who manage that. Rourke said from the monitors, the vehicles are moving. Everyone looked. All 3 of them pulling away from the curb in the same direction, unhurried, a controlled withdrawal. They got what they wanted from the demonstration, Celine said. Now they're waiting for morning. Damien looked at the feeds until the vehicles were gone. Then he said, "The location for the meeting. He mentioned it on the call." He looked at Rourke. "Harlow Terminal." Rourke's expression shifted slightly. I know what it is." Celine didn't know what it was. "Tell me." "Decommissioned shipping terminal on the harbor, 12 kilometers south." Rourke pulled up a satellite map on one of the monitors. "Volkov has been using it for container storage for 3 years. We always assumed it was a secondary operations point, but never confirmed." Celine looked at the map. The terminal sat on a peninsula of land that jutted into the harbor, connected to the mainland by a single access road. Water on 3 sides, one way in. Cargo cranes visible as thin lines in the satellite image. Structures identified as warehousing running along the terminal's interior. "When is the meeting?" "Tomorrow night, 10 o'clock. Damien's voice was flat. "He said to come through the main gate." "He'll have the road covered," Rourke said. "The water too, if he's being thorough." "He's being thorough," Celine said. Damien looked at her. "You said you've spent 3 years mapping their patterns." "Yes." "The terminal. Do you have anything on it?" She pulled the archives. Daniel's files included a single entry on a location identified by street address that matched the terminal, a note made in the last month of his life, one of the final entries before the file went silent. She had read it dozens of times without knowing what she was looking at. HT, secondary access. Loading dock 7, east face. Not on main manifest. Personnel rotation 48 hours. And below that, in different ink added later, they move people through here too. She turned the screen toward Damien. He read it. He read it again. "People," he said. "I never found corroborating documentation. It was the last note he made." She looked at the entry. Daniel's handwriting. The particular slant of the 7s that she had spent her whole childhood watching form on homework pages and birthday cards and grocery lists. I think that's when he understood what he was actually inside. Not just financial infrastructure, the full operation. And he started building the files. Within the month. Damien straightened. Something had settled in his face. Not peace, nothing like peace, but the quality of a decision that has been made completely, without reservation. The quality of a man who has gone past the point of weighing options and arrived at the single option that remains. "We take the meeting," he said. "On his terms," Rourke said. "No." Damien looked at the satellite map. "On ours." The next 14 hours were the most operationally dense of Celine's life, and she had spent 3 years doing things that qualified as operationally dense. Damien worked the phone and the secure laptop and the people who materialized throughout the morning at the safe house in ways she could not fully track. Men who arrived, were briefed in rooms she wasn't in, departed. Rourke coordinated in a shorthand with Damien that was nearly its own language. Celine contributed what she had, which was 3 years of documentation on the Volkov Syndicate's patterns, personnel, and physical infrastructure, and the specific knowledge of how Victor Sorin thought. Not because she had ever met him, but because you could read a person's character in the shape of their choices. And his choices were all over Daniel's files. He was patient. He was systematic. He hated improvisation, which was why tonight's operation had been in preparation for months rather than weeks. He controlled through demonstrated capability rather than direct threat. The 3 vehicles outside the safe house, the tracking on Elena's transport, the impossible call to a secure line. He showed what he could do and then waited for the other person to decide whether fighting was worth the cost. He was also, Celine believed with a certainty built from 3 years of study, a man who had been running such an overwhelming game for so long that the specific form of arrogance it produced had become invisible to him. He had stopped accounting for the possibility that someone on the opposing side had been as patient as he was, for as long as he had. She had not been as patient for the same reasons. She had been patient because she was alone and underfunded and operating without institutional support. But the files she had built in 3 years were, in their own way, as comprehensive as anything Victor Sorin had assembled on the people around him. At 9:45 in the evening, Celine sat in the back of an armored vehicle parked in darkness half a kilometer from Harlow Terminal and checked the earpiece she had been fitted with by a man whose name she never learned. The rain had returned in the late afternoon, lighter than the night before, but steady, the kind that settled into your clothes and didn't leave. "You don't have to be inside for this," Damien said from beside her. "I know. The federal team is positioned on the North Access Road. As soon as we have visual confirmation of Victor and Elena in the same location. I know the plan." He looked at her. In the dark interior of the vehicle, with the rain on the windows, he looked different than he did in safe houses and restaurants. Stripped of the operational efficiency, the machinery of managing people and information, he looked briefly like what he was. A man who was about to walk into a building where his wife was being held, because he had no alternative, and who was carrying the specific weight of someone who has spent his entire adult life operating in violence and is now inside a version of it he did not engineer. "For what it's worth," she said, "I don't think he'll kill her. Not before he has everything he wants from this meeting. And after." She didn't answer. "If this goes wrong," he said, "the files go to Calder's direct contact at the IG office, not through channels, directly. Rourke has the access architecture." "I know. You gave that up when you gave it to Rourke." "Yes." She had given it up that morning, deliberately, after thinking about it for an hour. She had given it up because holding information in reserve was an intelligence-gathering posture, and she was no longer gathering intelligence. She was using it. "It's the right move." Damien looked at her for a moment. "Your brother built good files." She felt it land in her chest, the simple weight of it. "He did. I'm going to make sure they mean something." She nodded. She did not trust her voice for more than that. He got out of the vehicle. She counted 10 seconds. Then she got out too. Harlow Terminal was enormous in the dark, the scale of it only visible through the cargo cranes that rose against the sky like the bones of something prehistoric, lit faintly at their peaks by aircraft warning lights. The water beyond the terminal was black and restless. The single access road ran straight toward the main gate, floodlights above it cutting orange cones through the rain. Damien walked the road alone. That was the agreement, the appearance of alone. Rourke's team was distributed in positions that Celine had helped identify from the satellite map and Daniel's note about the east face loading dock. She moved with two of them toward the terminal's perimeter fence at a point that the satellite image suggested was a secondary maintenance entrance. It was. The gate was locked. The man beside her had it open in 40 seconds. They moved inside. The terminal's interior was a landscape of scale. Shipping containers stacked 4 and 5 high in long rows, creating corridors of rusted metal that channeled the wind into low, constant moaning. Puddles on the concrete. The smell of salt water and diesel and something else she couldn't identify. The cranes overhead moved slightly in the wind, cables ticking against their structures. Her earpiece carried the audio of Damien's approach to the main building. His footsteps, his breathing, the sound of the main entry door opening. She tracked him through sound while she moved through the container rows toward the east face, toward loading dock 7, toward whatever Daniel had meant when he wrote, "They move people through here too." The building's east face was a long wall of corrugated steel with 6 numbered bay doors, all closed. The 7th bay was different, smaller, set slightly apart from the others. No number painted on it, but the edges of the frame worn in the way of a door used more frequently than the others. She stopped in front of it. The man beside her, she had started thinking of him as Tack because he moved with the precision of a trained operative and had not offered his name, held position at her shoulder. Through her earpiece, she heard a door open inside the building. And then a voice she had never heard but recognized immediately, the way you recognize the shape of something you've been studying from the evidence it leaves behind. "Mr. Varela." Victor Soren's voice was even and unaccented and calm, in the way of someone for whom calm had long since stopped being an effort. "You came on time." "I want to see my wife." Damien's voice. Flat. "In a moment. Sit down." Silence. "I said sit." A pause. Then the sound of a chair. Celine pressed the bay door. It was unlocked. She eased it open by centimeters, finding the space of the interior, a narrow access corridor, concrete, running parallel to the main warehouse floor with a partial wall between them. She could see through gaps in the wall structure where panels had been removed or corroded away. The warehouse interior was lit by portable flood lamps on tripods, casting hard white light. She counted 11 armed men she could see in various positions. Knew there were more. Victor Soren stood at a table in the center of the space, mid-50s, compact. A gray suit that belonged in an office building rather than an abandoned terminal, the specific composure of a man who has arranged every element of a situation to his preference. Elena was seated against the far wall. She was upright, alert. A restraint on each wrist attached to the chair, zip ties or cuffs. Celine couldn't see clearly. Her face was directed toward Damien, and her expression was something that the lighting and the distance made hard to read, but the posture said she was uninjured, and that posture said something else too, that she had been sitting with this for hours and had decided something in that time, some internal arrangement with whatever was happening to her, and that arrangement had produced stillness rather than fear. Celine filed it, kept moving along the corridor. "You've made things very complicated," Victor said. His voice carried easily through the gaps in the wall. 3 weeks ago, this was a simple financial resolution, a debt collected in the most economical way available. "You tried to kill my wife," Damien said. "I tried to send a message. The mechanism was your wife, yes. I apologize for the lack of elegance. It was a decision made lower in the organization than it should have been." A pause. "The people responsible for that specific operational choice are no longer in my organization." "Big of you." "I'm being honest with you, which you should interpret as respect. I have no interest in killing Elena Varela. I have significant interest in the documentation your associate has been compiling." A sound of something. Paper, perhaps. A folder sliding across a table. "As you can see, we have been aware of Ms. Vey's project for some time." "How long?" Damien said. "Since she contacted Marcus Wren. A useful attorney, Wren. He had certain obligations to us that predated his relationship with Ms. Vey by several years." Victor's voice carried no satisfaction, only information. "The documentation she assembled is genuinely impressive. Your brother was thorough, Ms. Vey." Celine froze in the corridor. He knew she was here. He was speaking to the room, not just to Damien. "I know you're in the East Corridor," Victor said, still in the same even voice. "Please don't make the next 30 seconds more complicated than they need to be." The man behind her, Tack, touched her arm. She shook her head once. She kept moving forward, not retreating, because retreating was the same as stopping, and stopping was the same as giving the next 30 seconds to Victor Soren's management. She found the panel opening that gave the widest view of the warehouse floor. Through it, she could see Damien at the table, sitting as he had been instructed, his hands visible. Victor standing opposite. Elena against the wall. The 11 visible armed men in their positions. She could also see the man standing 6 feet from the corridor wall, aimed at the panel she was looking through, who had been waiting for her since before she arrived. He was not one of the 11 she had counted. "The documentation," Victor said, "represents a significant liability to my organization and to a number of associated individuals in federal service. I am prepared to offer a resolution that allows everyone in this building to leave intact." He looked at Damien. "Ms. Vey provides the access architecture for all 3 servers. The material is reviewed and appropriately managed. In exchange, the debt against the Harmon family is discharged. Elena Varela is released, and neither you nor Ms. Vey is harmed." "And the federal corruption investigation," Damien said. "Agent Croft manages his own affairs. I don't make representations on his behalf. And after tonight, you just stop." "I stopped the current operation, yes. I have no interest in a prolonged conflict with your organization. This was never about you, Varela. It was about the files." Silence. Celine pressed herself against the corridor wall and thought very fast. The man with the rifle was positioned to stop her from advancing further, not to shoot her, because if he had been instructed to shoot her, the shot would already have happened. Victor wanted the access architecture, which meant he needed her functional and cooperative. The rifle was leverage. Everything was leverage with this man. She thought about the access architecture. 3 servers. She had given the full architecture to Rourke that morning, deliberately, because she had been thinking about this meeting even then. thinking about what Victor Soren would ask for and what it would mean to give it. Rourke had the architecture. But the morning before the transfer, she had made a change to the third server. A small one. The kind of change that would not be visible in a casual audit of the access logs, but would be apparent the moment someone used the credentials to attempt a full extraction. She had left a door open that shouldn't exist, and behind that door was not the original content of the server, but a mirror of it that would survive the extraction attempt and simultaneously generate an authenticated transmission to Calder's direct contact at the IG office, the one Damien had told her about the night before, containing the complete communication logs between Croft and the Volkov syndicate, time-stamped, verified. Impossible to suppress through normal channels because it would arrive simultaneously at 3 separate destinations she had wired into the transmission protocol at 2 in the morning while everyone else was sleeping. The change had taken 11 minutes to implement. She had not told anyone because anyone she told was a potential failure point, and she had already had enough failure points. The problem was that if she gave Victor the access architecture, even the genuine one she had given Rourke, and he used it to access the third server before Calder's people had time to act on the transmission, he would see what she had done. And the next 30 seconds would become something different. She needed time. "I'll give you the access architecture," she said, loudly enough to carry through the panel gap into the warehouse. She heard Damien's position shift, a small sound, the adjustment of a man who has just learned something unexpected. On one condition. Victor looked toward the corridor wall. He had the patience to look slowly. "Ms. Vey. I want to see her first, directly. I want to see that she's uninjured, and I want to hear her say it." A pause that was 4 seconds. She counted. "Bring her," Victor said. One of the armed men moved to Elena and detached the restraint from the chair, keeping it on her wrists but freeing her from the seat. He walked her toward the corridor wall, toward the panel gap. Elena came to stand in front of the opening. Up close, her face was clear. A cut at her hairline, small, dried, probably from the initial detainment. Her eyes found Celine's through the gap with an immediacy that suggested she had known where to look. "Are you hurt?" Celine said. "I'm okay." Elena's voice was low and completely steady. "Are you?" "Working on it." Elena looked at her for one more second. Then, very slightly, she tilted her chin downward and back up. The smallest possible nod, the gesture of someone communicating, "I understand what you're doing. Keep going." And Celine did not know what Elena Varela understood or whether her understanding was accurate, but she felt it land in her chest like something solid, in a room full of things that had no weight. She straightened. "The access architecture," she said to Victor Soren through the wall. "I'll need a device. 5 minutes." Victor said, "You have 3. The device arrived through the panel gap, a tablet, clean, handed through by the man with the rifle who maintained his position and his aim without expression. Celine took it. She opened the access interface. She typed. She typed the genuine credentials for servers 1 and 2. She typed the genuine credentials for server 3. And in the authentication field for the third server, the field that would complete the access request, she typed an additional sequence that she had memorized that morning at 2 a.m., a sequence that was not part of the standard credentials but had been woven into the door she had built, the sequence that would trigger the transmission before the access completed. She handed the tablet back through the gap. "It's done," she said. From his position at the table, Victor Soren picked up his own device and began the verification process. Celine watched through the panel. She watched his man working the access beside him. She watched server 1 come up, server 2, the beginning of server 3. She counted. In her head, in the cold corridor with the rain outside, and the rifle behind her and the harbor water black through the building's far windows, she counted the seconds it would take for the transmission to clear its first destination and wondered if Calder was awake and how fast federal agents moved when the information was already in their hands and already verified and already impossible to suppress. The man beside Victor said something she couldn't hear. Victor looked at the screen. He looked for longer than the verification should have taken. He looked up. His eyes went to the corridor wall. "Interesting," he said. In the same breath, from somewhere outside the building, a sound arrived that was not thunder and not machinery. a rhythmic percussion that built in seconds from distant to immediate. Helicopters. Victor looked at the ceiling of the warehouse. His face did not change. His expression was that of a man encountering a variable he had not included in his calculation, which was, Celine recognized, the rarest thing she had ever seen on it. "That's not possible," he said. Not to anyone. To himself. The words of a man auditing his own architecture. Damien stood up from the chair. The armed men shifted. A collective tightening, positions adjusting, the organization of people who have been trained for a raid response, but have not been told there would be one tonight. Victor said something in a sharp undertone to the man beside him. Elena, freed from the chair but still restrained at the wrists, was standing near the corridor wall, and she moved, small, deliberate movements, toward the panel gap and the corridor beyond it. The helicopter noise became enormous. Floodlights hit the terminal's skylights from above, turning the interior white. Through the building's structure, Celine could hear vehicle engines, multiple, from the direction of the main gate, the kind of engines that belonged to federal approach vehicles and that moved with the specific speed of people who had been waiting for authorization and had just received it. Damien flipped the table. The table went over with a sound like a gunshot. Damien moved the instant the wood hit the floor, not toward the exit, not toward cover, but toward Elena, because there was exactly one priority in the building, and it was the woman with her wrists still restrained standing 10 feet from him in the white helicopter light. He crossed the distance in 4 strides and got his body between her and the nearest armed man before that man had fully committed to a new position, and he took the hit he expected, a shoulder, hard, from someone trying to intercept, and absorbed it and kept moving, driving forward through the impact the way a man moves when stopping is not one of the available options. Elena didn't freeze. She moved toward him at the same moment he moved toward her, and they met in the chaotic middle of the warehouse floor, with the floodlights turning everything to white and gray shadow, and the helicopter noise so large it had stopped being a sound and become a physical condition of the air. "Down," he said into her ear, and they went down together behind an overturned equipment crate. Celine came through the panel gap at a low run. The corridor wall panel was not designed for a person to move through. She took the edge of it across her shoulder and felt the specific deep pain of metal against bone and filed it and kept moving. Tack was behind her, covering, and the man with the rifle had made a decision in the moment of the helicopter arrival that did not include maintaining his aim on a single unarmed woman, which was the correct operational decision and also the one she had been counting on. The warehouse floor was controlled chaos, the kind that had a structure under it if you knew how to read it. Victor's men were reacting to the aerial presence and the vehicle engines converging on the main gate, which meant their attention was distributed outward, toward the perimeter threat, and the interior of the building had a fractional window of reduced coverage. Celine read it in the first 2 seconds and moved through it. She found Damien and Elena behind the equipment crate. "The East Bay door," she said. 30 meters. It opens to the loading dock, and the dock has water access. Damien looked at her over Elena's head. "Federal approach is from the North Road." "I know. The east side is secondary coverage. Rourke's team should be..." A burst of gunfire from the building's north entrance, controlled and purposeful, the sound of a federal entry team moving with authorization. Return fire from Victor's men, heavier and less organized. The warehouse floor became louder. "Move," Damien said. Elena moved. She ran with her wrists still bound, her arms held slightly out for balance, and she ran without hesitation or wasted motion in a way that surprised Celine until she remembered 11 months of watching Elena Varela at dinner tables. The careful, deliberate way she held herself, the economy of her movements. The body knew things the mind hadn't fully processed yet. They hit the East Bay door. Damien shouldered it open. The rain and the harbor smell came in together, cold and immediate. The loading dock was a concrete platform extending over the water, old crane infrastructure rusting above it, a narrow maintenance walkway running along the building's east face. 2 men at the far end of the walkway, both in tactical gear, both turning at the sound of the door. Rourke's team, positioned exactly where the satellite map and Daniel's note had suggested they should be. Rourke himself was there. He looked at Celine. He looked at Elena. He looked at Damien. "Perimeter is active, Yiskra," he said. "Federal has the north gate. We've got the east and the water. Victor, Damien said. Still inside. His people are fragmenting. 3 arrests at the south fence already. Damien looked back at the building. Through the bay door, the sounds of the interior operation were audible. Gunfire in short controlled bursts, voices calling positions, the specific acoustic signature of a space being systematically cleared. He'll try the water, Celine said. Rourke looked at her. We have a boat at the dockhead. Not his boat. He came in through the harbor side. She was looking at the water, dark and moving, the lights of Black Hollow reflected and broken across the surface. The satellite image showed a secondary dock on the terminal's south face, not connected to the main platform. Independent access. Damien said, You didn't mention a south dock. I didn't know it mattered until right now. He looked at her for one beat. How far? 200 meters around the building's exterior. He looked at Rourke. Get Elena to the federal line. Then to Elena. Go with Rourke. Elena looked at him. The restraints were still on her wrists and her hair was wet, and she had a dried cut at her hairline, and she looked at her husband with an expression that carried 3 years of marriage and the last 24 hours, and the specific knowledge of a woman who has been calculating odds since the moment she was put in a chair. Come back, she said, not a plea, a requirement. Yeah, he said. She went with Rourke. Damien looked at Celine. You don't have to come. I know where the dock is, she said. You don't. He didn't argue. She had expected him to argue, and he didn't, which she filed as a piece of information about who he had decided she was over the course of the last 24 hours. They moved along the east face of the building in the rain, tight against the corrugated wall, the dock water black and loud below them. The sounds of the federal operation inside were muffled now, the building's mass between them and the activity. The harbor was open, and the wind off the water was cold enough to make her eyes water. Around the building's southeast corner, the structure changed. Older construction, the original terminal infrastructure predating the warehouse addition. Lower roof line and a rusted iron stairway running down to a secondary dock platform barely visible in the dark below. A boat tied there. Small, fast-looking, running lights off. And Victor Soren standing at the top of the stairs. He had lost the jacket. His gray shirt was dark at the shoulder. Blood or rain or both. He had a phone in one hand and nothing visible in the other, which meant the weapon was somewhere she couldn't see. He was looking at the phone with the focused attention of a man making a final operational decision, and he looked up when they came around the corner and his face did the thing it had done in the warehouse. The slight, controlled recalibration of a man encountering a variable he had not accounted for. The transmission already went, Celine said. She said it immediately, before he could frame the moment the way he preferred. Calder's office, the IG direct contact, and a third destination I'm not going to name. It went 40 minutes ago when I entered the access sequence. Everything on that server, everything Daniel built, and everything I built on top of it. Victor looked at her. The rain fell between them. Croft is already being contacted, she said. Whatever he does in the next 4 hours, run, suppress, destroy evidence, is being done in front of people who have the corroborating documentation to contextualize every move he makes. He has nowhere to put it. You wired the access sequence, Victor said. Yes. When? This morning, before I told anyone the architecture. She looked at him steadily. I've been building things in isolation for 3 years. It's a hard habit to break. Something moved in his expression that was not quite the thing she had expected. Not fury, not the cold recalculation of someone adjusting tactics. It was almost recognition. The look of a man encountering a method he understood because he had used it himself. Your brother, he said. Yes. He built the same way, isolated, layered. Victor looked at the phone in his hand. We didn't want to kill him. He was the best financial architect we had encountered in 15 years. The decision to remove him was made against my preference. She felt it in her chest. The specific pain of a truth arriving in a form she had not anticipated. Not comfort, not closure. Just a fact about Daniel's death delivered by the man responsible for it, with the flat affect of a professional discussing a professional matter. That's supposed to mean something to me, she said. No, Victor said. It's supposed to be accurate. He looked at the phone one more time. Then he put it in his pocket. The boat won't help me, will it? The harbor is covered, Damien said. He had not spoken since they came around the corner. He stood slightly behind Celine's right shoulder, and his presence there, she, deliberate, contained, said that he had decided something about how this moment should go and had positioned himself accordingly. Victor looked at him. I underestimated the timeline on the transmission. You underestimated her, Damien said. A pause. Yes. Victor looked at Celine. I accounted for patience. I did not account for someone patient enough to build the mechanism before walking into the trap. I learned it from my brother, she said. Her voice came out level. She was not going to give him the sound of her grief. That was hers. He built things in isolation, and he built them to last beyond him. I just finished what he started. Victor Soren looked at her for a long moment in the rain above the harbor. Then he sat down on the top step of the iron stairway with the precision of a man choosing the terms of the only action available to him, and he put his hands on his knees where they were visible, and he waited. The federal team came around the building's south corner 40 seconds later. Celine stood back and watched them take him. It was not dramatic. He did not resist. He stated his name when asked and stood when instructed and walked between two agents with the careful posture of a man who had decided that how he moved in this moment was the last thing he controlled. She watched his face as they walked him past her and toward the north side of the building and the waiting vehicles. He did not look at her again. She stood on the wet concrete above the harbor and breathed. The rain fell on her upturned face and she let it, and she breathed and she thought about Daniel. Not the voicemail, not the files, not the 3 years of what came after. Just Daniel. The Sunday morning calls, the way he laughed, which was too loud for enclosed spaces and never occurred to him to modulate. The grocery lists with the handwriting she had spent 3 years reading in annotated documents and had never been able to look at without feeling the specific shape of what was gone. She breathed. Behind her, Damien stood without speaking. He gave her the silence, and she used it. After a while, she said, It's done. Not quite, he said, but close. She turned around. He was looking at the building, at the activity of the federal operation visible around its corners, lights and vehicles, and the organized movement of people doing large, complex work. His face had the quality of someone on the other side of a sustained effort, not yet arrived at rest, but no longer holding against collapse. Croft, she said. Calder called while you were at the stairway. He tried to access the IG's filing system remotely from a personal device at 11:47. It logged his credentials against material he had no clearance to review. Damien looked at her. The access attempt is itself evidence. He handed them the thread. He panicked. People who have been in control for too long always panic the same way, he said. They try to manage the problem using the same methods that made them safe for years. They can't adjust. She thought about Victor on the stairway, about the precise way he had sat down. Some of them can. Some of them, he agreed. They walked back around the building together. The rain was lightening, not stopping, but thinning, the weight going out of it. The harbor behind them was still dark and moving. The federal operation wound down over the next 3 hours with the methodical thoroughness of an action that had been planned for longer than tonight. Celine spent most of it in the back of a federal vehicle giving a preliminary statement to an agent from Calder's office, a woman named Osai, careful and unrushed, who asked questions in a sequence that told Celine she had already read a significant portion of the archived material and was using the interview to fill specific gaps rather than establish the general shape. Celine answered everything. She had spent 3 years deciding who deserved to receive the information she had been carrying, and Calder's office, imperfect as any institution, was the right destination. The files were built to be used. Daniel had built them to be used. It was time for them to do what they were for. At 2 a.m, Osei closed her notebook. We'll need you available for formal deposition within the week. I'll be available. You understand that your own role in the intelligence gathering will be reviewed. I understand what... Celine looked at her steadily. I operated without authorization. I made contact with a compromised attorney. I conducted a private intelligence operation against a federal official and a criminal organization over a period of 3 years. I understand what the review will cover. Osei looked at her. The documentation you provided it's comprehensive. The kind of thing that takes institutional resources and years to build. It took one person and 3 years, Celine said. And my brother's work before that. Yes. Osei's voice carried something that was not quite personal, more like the acknowledgement of a professional recognizing the scale of something she was adjacent to. I'm sorry about your brother. Celine nodded. The words landed clean, and she accepted them that way, without deflection. Thank you. She got out of the vehicle. Dawn came slowly to Harlow Terminal, the sky changing from black to dark gray to the particular bruised pale of early light over harbor water. The crane stood enormous and still against it. Most of the federal vehicles had departed. A perimeter remained. The secondary dock on the south face was being processed by an evidence team, the small fast boat still tied at its berth, Victor's phone recovered and bagged. Celine sat on a concrete barrier at the terminal's edge and watched the water change color with the light. She had not been aware of being exhausted until she stopped moving. Now the exhaustion was total. Not just the last 24 hours, but the 3 years of it. The accumulated weight of sustained vigilance finally locating itself in her body as something specific and physical. Her shoulder where the panel had caught her was deeply sore. Her hands, resting on her knees, looked older than she expected in the early light. She heard footsteps and looked up. Elena Varela was walking toward her from the direction of the medical station the federal team had set up near the main gate. The restraints were gone from her wrists. She had a blanket around her shoulders that she was wearing with the complete unconsciousness of someone who has moved past caring how things look. She sat down beside Celine on the concrete barrier without asking, looked at the water. They sat without speaking for a while. My parents, Elena said finally. They're in federal protective custody pending the broader investigation. Their testimony will be needed regarding the Volkov debt arrangements. Celine paused. They cooperated at the end. That will be considered. I know. Elena looked at her hands. The small cut at her hairline had been cleaned and closed with a butterfly bandage. I know where they'll be. I meant the other part. The part I have to figure out how to carry. Celine didn't offer anything to that. There was nothing to offer. Some weights didn't have better shapes. They just had to be carried until the person carrying them became strong enough for the specific load. You could have told him, Celine said after a moment. When he asked what you wanted, you could have said something different. Elena was quiet for a moment. I thought about it. She looked at the horizon. For about 3 seconds in that room, I thought about it. A pause. But executing your in-laws doesn't actually fix the thing that's broken. And it was already broken before the restaurant. I just didn't know it. She pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders. My father looked at me before they took him out. He opened his mouth, like he wanted to say something. I know, Celine said. I was there. What do you think he wanted to say? Celine thought about it honestly, about Preston Harmon's face in the doorway of the safe house, the devastated, crumpled face of a man who had arrived somewhere he could not leave, who had opened his mouth and then closed it again at her single head shake. I think he wanted to say he was sorry, she said. I think he was going to say it, and then he looked at me and understood it wasn't going to be enough. And he chose to say nothing rather than say something that wasn't enough. She paused. That might be the most honest thing he did in the whole situation. Elena sat with that. The light on the water shifted. The sun somewhere below the horizon, pushing color up into the gray sky, copper and pale yellow at the edges. The harbor moving constantly, indifferent and unchanged, as it had been before any of this and would be after all of it. He had a younger sister, Celine said. She had not planned to say it. Daniel. She died when he was 16. Car accident, the real kind. He used to talk about it sometimes. Not the grief part. He didn't talk about that directly, but about what it changed in him afterward, how it made him very careful about the people he let matter. Elena listened. He wasn't careful enough in the end, Celine said. He let people matter at work. He thought loyalty went both directions in all circumstances. He was wrong.
She stopped. I spent 3 years being angry at him for being wrong, for trusting people who didn't deserve it, for dying because he misjudged something. She looked at her hands. I think I stopped being angry at him somewhere in the last 24 hours. I'm not sure exactly when. When you stopped doing it alone, Elena said. Celine looked at her. Elena shrugged slightly, the gesture of someone who has had a long night and has earned the right to say direct things. You spent 3 years building something in isolation because you didn't trust anyone, and then you handed a note to a man you'd been watching from across a restaurant because you couldn't watch someone die alone. She paused. That's not strategy. That's just who you are. Celine thought about that, about the moment she had crossed the restaurant floor with the Barolo in her hand, her heart doing something terrible in her chest. About the 3 days before it when she had debated and not decided and then crossed the floor anyway because there was no actual decision to make, there was just the person she was, which had always been going to do that. Daniel would have done the same thing, she said. Probably, Elena said. That's why they killed him. It landed harder than expected. Not cruel, just the hard edge of a truth stated cleanly by someone who had spent the last several hours in her own kind of reckoning with what people did and why. Yes, Celine said. Probably. They sat in the early light until Damien appeared from inside the terminal. He had a coffee in each hand. Bad facility coffee, the kind in foam cups, the same fundamental category of bad as the kitchenette in the safe house. And he gave one to Elena without comment and looked at Celine. She shook her head. He sat down on the barrier on the other side of Elena, and the three of them faced the harbor and the approaching dawn and the dying weight of the night behind them. After a while, Damien said, The organization is going to take some months to stabilize. Victor ran a significant portion of the city's criminal infrastructure directly, and the parts he didn't run directly he influenced. There's going to be a period of disorder. Someone will fill it, Celine said. Someone always does. He drank his coffee. I'm not going to pretend I'm not one of the options. I know. But how it gets filled matters. The debt system. The mechanism Victor used on the Harmons and 39 other families your brother identified. That ends. I'm not running that. She looked at him. He was looking at the water, his face in profile, saying it to the harbor rather than to her in the way of someone who is stating a position rather than asking for a response. That's a significant amount of leverage to walk away from, she said. I know what it is. He paused. Your brother documented 39 families. Calder's review will identify more. Those debts, the syndicate's claims against those people, they don't have legal standing and they never did. The fear was the enforcement mechanism. When the enforcement goes away, the debts go away. Celine thought about the 39 files in Daniel's archive, the Harmons and 38 others, ordinary people who had borrowed at a desperate moment and been trapped in a structure designed to never release them. People who had been carrying it for years, making payments that never reduced the total, doing things they would not otherwise have done because the alternative was violence. He would have wanted that, she said. Daniel. He documented it for a reason, Damien said. He didn't just collect the information because it was useful against Victor. He collected it because someone would eventually need to know who had been hurt. The sun broke the horizon, a thin line of orange along the edge of the water, spreading slowly. The cranes above the terminal caught it first, the tops of them going gold while the base structures were still in shadow. Elena tilted her face toward it. She closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them, she looked like someone who has allowed herself one small piece of uncomplicated sensation after a very long night, and she looked like it was enough. 3 weeks passed. The federal investigation expanded outward from the core of Calder's initial filing with the steady, methodical momentum of an institutional process that had been given irrefutable material to work with. Agent Croft was suspended within 48 hours of the Harlow terminal operation, his access credentials suspended, and his case files sequestered pending review. The suspension became an arrest on the 4th day. He did not cooperate. His attorney released a statement that was largely irrelevant because the documentation Celine had transmitted rendered his cooperation optional. 7 of Victor's senior organization were arrested in the days following Harlow Terminal. Two were identified attempting to leave the country through private aviation and were detained with what Rourke described to Celine without elaboration as appropriate emphasis. The Volkov syndicate's financial architecture, the shell companies, the debt instruments, the legitimate-facing businesses, began to collapse under federal seizure orders that arrived sequentially over 10 days, each one building on the documentation from the previous and together forming the shape of an organization being taken apart from the inside out. Victor Sorin was formally charged on the 14th day. He appeared in court in a suit that was somewhat less precise than the gray one he had worn at Harlow Terminal, and he stood while the charges were read with the same careful posture he had used walking away from the stairway dock. A man who had decided that how he moved in public was the last thing he could control, and who controlled it with complete consistency. Celine watched the court appearance on a laptop in the apartment she had returned to for the first time in weeks. The apartment smelled like absence, like a place that had been lived in and then stopped being lived in and was now waiting to find out which it would be again. She had cleaned the windows that morning, which she did not fully understand as a choice until she was doing it, standing with a cloth in her hand, working the same deliberate circles she had used on crystal glasses at Valerio's, looking out at the city's early morning below her. She turned off the laptop when the coverage shifted to a legal analyst, and she sat in the quiet apartment and thought about what came next. The question had arrived approximately 48 hours after Harlow Terminal and had not left. It was not an anxious question, more like a door she had not noticed before, standing where a wall used to be with light on the other side of it. For 3 years, what comes next had been fully occupied by the work. The files, the patterns, the careful, invisible life of someone who has made themselves into an instrument for a specific purpose. There had been no space in that for anything else, and she had not wanted space for anything else because the anything else would have required her to acknowledge what 3 years of purposeful solitude had cost. She picked up her phone. She called a number she had not called in 2 years. It rang 4 times. Celine? Her friend Margot's voice, surprised and cautious in the way of someone who has learned to hold open wounds lightly. Is this... Are you... I'm okay, Celine said. I'm in the city. I wanted to know if you wanted to get coffee. A silence. Then, yeah. Yes. When? This morning, if you're free. I'm free, Margot said immediately, in the tone of someone clearing whatever was on the calendar, whether they were free or not. Where? Celine looked out the window at the city below her, at the streets and the buildings, and the ordinary ongoing life of a place that had no idea what had happened in it 3 weeks ago and would not know, mostly, and that was fine. That was how it was supposed to work. You pick, she said, somewhere you like. She ended the call. She sat a moment. Then she got up and went to the kitchen and started the coffee maker for the first time in the 3 years since Daniel had given it to her as a housewarming present for an apartment she had moved into 6 months before he died and had used as a staging ground for everything that came after. It worked. The sound of it, the specific domestic hiss and gurgle, was somehow unexpected, the way familiar things are unexpected when you have been away from them long enough. The same morning that Celine Vey made coffee in her apartment for the first time in 3 years, Damien Varela called her from the penthouse 22 floors above the part of the city that faced the ocean. I have a proposition, he said. I know, she said. You mentioned it. You haven't answered. I'm thinking. The position is intelligence advisor, not operational. You'd have full latitude on what you engage with and what you don't. A pause. I'm not recruiting you to do what you did for the last 3 years. I'm asking you to do it for a different outcome. She poured her coffee. She looked out the window. There's a condition. I know your condition. Then you know my answer depends on whether you can actually do it, whether it's a thing you're capable of. You'll tell me if it isn't, he said. Yes, I will. That's the whole point, Damien said. That's exactly the point. She thought about it. She thought about 3 years of working alone, of being an instrument aimed at a single target, of the particular shape of a life organized entirely around a purpose that had now been served. She thought about Margot's voice on the phone, surprised and cautious, saying yes, when I'm free. She thought about Elena's face turning toward the sunrise at Harlow Terminal.
She thought about Daniel, about what he had tried to do and what it had cost him and what he had left behind, and about the fact that the archive he had built in the last weeks of his life was now part of the formal record of a federal prosecution that would run for years and would, imperfectly and institutionally and with all the friction of real processes conducted by real people, constitute the thing he had been trying to accomplish when he built it. Not justice, exactly. The word was too clean for what the process actually was, but something that mattered, something with weight. "Call me next week," she said. "Monday." "Monday," she agreed. She ended the call and drank her coffee in the quiet apartment. The city moved below the window. A morning in Black Hollow, ordinary and ongoing, traffic and noise, and the particular low light of a sky that couldn't decide between clouds and sun and had settled, for the moment, on both. On the kitchen counter, beside the coffee maker Daniel had given her, was the crystal polishing cloth from her uniform jacket. She had found it in her pocket 3 days after Harlow Terminal and had put it on the counter and had not decided what to do with it. She picked it up now, turned it over in her hands. The cloth was ruined, stained and torn at one edge from the panel in the warehouse corridor. But the material of it was still there, the familiar weight of something held for a long time. She put it down. Later that afternoon, 2 envelopes arrived at the federal field office handling the Harmon protective custody case, one addressed to Preston, one to Diane. The return address was a law firm's routing box with no sender name. Inside each was a single sheet of paper, no salutation, no signature. 3 sentences. "You chose wrong. You know you chose wrong. Whether you spend the rest of your life choosing differently is the only question left that matters." The federal agent processing incoming mail for the protective custody cases documented the envelopes in the case file and set them aside and moved on to other things. Whether Preston and Diane Harmon read the letters and what they did with the reading was not something Celine would ever know. She had not sent them expecting to know. There was a Thursday evening 3 weeks after that, 5 weeks after Valerio's, 6 weeks after the last Friday night, Celine had spent polishing crystal glasses and watching a private dining room through frosted glass, when she stood on the street outside a small restaurant in the north part of the city that had nothing to do with any of the people or places of the last months. Just a place Margot liked because the lighting was good, and the kitchen stayed open late. Margot was already inside. Celine could see her through the window, looking at her phone, a glass of white wine in front of her. Celine stood on the sidewalk for a moment. The city moved around her. People on their way to other places, cars, the ordinary Friday night noise of a city that had survived itself again, as cities do, routinely, without credit. The air was cold but not raining. The streetlights had come on. She thought about the note she had pressed beneath a man's hand in a restaurant 6 weeks ago. The 2 seconds it had taken for him to read it and decide to believe it, the way the chandelier had swung in the dark when it fell. She thought about how small the decision had looked from the outside. A waitress refilling a wine glass. She thought about Daniel. She pushed the door open and went inside. Margot looked up. Her face did the thing that faces do when someone you have missed for a long time walks back into a room. A complicated, compressed series of emotions that resolved itself into simple, present gladness. "Hi," Margot said. "Hi," Celine said, and sat down. Outside, the city kept moving beneath the streetlights, indifferent and alive. Somewhere to the south, the harbor received the dark water without comment. Somewhere 22 floors above the ocean-facing district, Elena Varela stood on a rooftop terrace tending to the orchids she had transplanted there from the apartment's interior, working carefully in the cold evening air, her hands in the soil. Damien stood in the doorway watching her and not saying anything, which was exactly what she needed him to do, and which he knew it, and he did it. The orchids would take weeks to adjust to the new conditions. They were fragile and specific in their requirements and did not tolerate disruption well. But they were alive. And Elena Varela, who had always known more about what things needed in order to survive than she had ever been given credit for, worked at them with patient hands and a face that was not at peace. That was something more complicated and more real than peace, something on the other side of the worst night of her life that did not have a clean name but was present and growing, and in the cold rooftop air of a city that had almost taken her without asking, undeniably, stubbornly, hers. The Thursday night deepened into the city. The lights held against it. Somewhere in the Federal Records Building on the east side, 39 case files corresponding to 39 families waited in the formal darkness of an ongoing investigation, each one representing a debt that had existed as a weapon and would now be dismantled as evidence, leaving behind nothing but the ordinary, complicated lives of people who had survived something that had not been fair to them. Celine Vey ordered a glass of wine. She sat with her friend in the good light of a restaurant that had nothing to do with anything, and the city outside moved through its Friday night, and the night was quiet, and nothing was finished but the worst of it was done. And she was still here, and for now, that was enough.